So maybe we start with you just saying your name beautifully, as only you can.
Okay. My name is Nuotama Bodomo, and I'm a film director. I've made a number of short films, Bone Shaker, Afronauts, and Then Everybody Dies. I'm currently trying to build and develop my first feature film.
Do you consider yourself a feminist, and what does feminism mean to you?
Okay, my short answer is yes, I would still consider myself a feminist. And I want to answer it like that just to sort of highlight the sort of back and forth that I've gone through of like, am I a feminist or not? I think I'm very much a feminist just because I can't think about the, let's say, physical and infrastructural things that feminism has won for me to be able to sit here educated as I am, free as I am in many ways, you know. Those are largely due in the societies that I've benefited from. Those are largely due to the wins of the feminist movement. But it's a very complicated yes, you know, for me, because I think that for me, I want to feed in sort of like an African perspective. And from the one with that, I mean, like maybe even an African traditional religions perspective. And then this perspective of the fact that a lot of the feminists that we talk about in sort of like, let's say an Americanized feminist history had really forgotten the figure of the Black woman in their theorizing. And I think that that has to be really thought of, you know. For the longest time, I was also calling myself a womanist, just to like sort of like bring in more the work of Black women specifically. But that too can be questioned.
What role does intimacy play in your work?
Intimacy is incredibly important to my work, just because I think when you're making a film, intimacy is the stuff of a film or the stuff of a scene. So a film can be a big historical drama or a big epic, but to fill the total runtime, you have to have moments. And those moments, I think, collectively create intimacy. Often film is theorized as excessive, gigantic, and we're really talking about a specific kind of film in the way that you wouldn't compare every book ever written to a bestseller, something on the bestseller list, right? Not every film is a blockbuster film. And I think that even theorists that I highly respect, for example, Saidiya Hartman in her essay, Venus in Two Acts, she's frequently comparing the intimacy of history to the sort of like grandiosity or excessiveness of film. And I love her. She's one of my favorite theorists in the world. But that assumption about film, I feel like comes up so often. And I think that for me, I think film, just like what she's calling the intimacy of history, that same work is the work of a film, if that makes sense. I'm very often interested in African historical narratives. You know, I've spent a long time trying to craft a feature version of a film called Afronauts, which follows the true story of the Zambia Space Academy. But I've also, you know, I'm now talking about this legend of Yanenga, a warrior princess from Gambaga in northern Ghana, who eventually decided to leave her kingdom, escape her kingdom. And in escaping, you know, ended up having a son who then founded the Moshi Empire. So I really got into her story for many reasons, just because of how powerful and amazing she is as a figure, but especially because I started to think about the fact that everything that Yanenga did that made her awesome, she did before having her child, let's say. Let's not say everything she did that made her awesome, but everything that we remember her for, she did before having her child. And yet, I think we only remember her because she had a son that founded the Moshi Empire. So it started to create this really like big thing for me of like, who else have we forgotten in a society that historicizes patrilineally? Who do we forget, you know? And so on one hand, it's really wanting to tell her story, but really tell it from the point of view that really opens up the fact that there are many like her in our history that we don't have access to because of how history is written, specifically within the context of African historicizing, right? It's something that I don't really want to overblame colonialism for. I think there's a colonial aspect as to why she's forgotten for sure. But I think that we can also, you know, speaking amongst ourselves as Africans, then start to talk about like our traditions and our, for example, in this case, patrilineal traditions that have erased stories like hers, and then remember her because she had a son. But when we talk about Yanenga, we talk about the fact that she commanded a battalion, was like a very meticulous soldier, but she was that way before she had Ouedraogo. So these African histories are really important to me, but they're important to me from the perspective of trying to situate them in the everyday. I think when I hear about these figures, and I'm thinking about these like grand historical perspectives, I'm just often motivated by these things of how to craft the daily life, the real time. I think that's like the sort of like beauty of film and sort of like obsession of the filmmaker, is how to craft real time, something that feels like real time. And so intimacy for me is the stuff of that and the things you come up with. And, you know, because I did mention Saidiya Hartman, I think like her concept of critical fabulation really sings for me in terms of like when you're studying history and you come up against these gaps that can't be filled because of perspectives, who was doing the writing, who was doing the speaking that was documented. When you come up against these holes in the histories, what do you do with them? You fabulate, you create, right? You write. And I think, you know, I started by saying that she was dividing history from something as excessive as cinema, you know, but I do think it's the same work. And I do think that for me, intimacy is the sort of driving force of why I would want to take on certain historical perspectives, because I think a lot about who is forgotten in the historicizing and what is left out in the historicizing. And I think crafting and writing from a gaze of intimacy, to me, is sort of like the reason for retelling these stories and telling them again and telling them from a modern perspective and telling them currently. It's like, I think intimacy becomes the access point.
I feel that so beautifully in your work. Like, you practice exactly what you preach. Like, I feel your sets must be such a safe space to encourage that kind of vulnerability. And I really feel your magic touch there.
I think in terms of sets and how to create this intimacy, it's a work in progress, because I inherited a film set culture that is entirely militaristic, machoistic, not really set up for somebody like me to be respected and heard. And so I can't say that I stood up on my first set and ran the most, you know, ethical, wonderful set ever. But I can say that it has been a forever progressive process, you know, of trying to build that. And I'm now also coming into a part of my career where I have the authority to start enacting that in bigger ways. A few years ago, I was part of the New Negroes Film Society Black Women Film Conference, the inaugural one in 2019. And we had a sort of roundtable panel. I think it was the filmmaker Adepero Duye who mentioned that, like, you know, when we're on set, the way we speak, we say we're shooting, you know, we use militaristic language to discuss what we're doing, you know, and in what ways can we change that very language, you know, to adjust what it means to be on set.
I mean, this is why I don't work in the film industry anymore. Like, it just about killed me. I felt it so violent. Does slowness play a part in your work?
Slowness plays a huge part of my work. I don't know if I can speak to the sort of like aesthetic construction or poetic construction of my work and talk about slowness, but definitely in terms of my craft, my process, slowness plays a huge role. The way I create may be called slow simply because it is unlike what is fast, what is, you know, here I have an idea and then it's done. You know what I mean? For me, when I'm saying I have an idea, meaning I want to sit with it, I want to test it out in the world in a smaller way. I want to research it. I want to see what it is. I want to see what it is outside me. And I want to create worlds, not just from my brain as a genius artist, but worlds that come in from being in relationship with a context, right? And I think that is what kind of reads and gets filtered as slowness in my work, or in my process rather, but it's the way that I want to create. And I would say that it's almost like the difference between an ejaculation and a pregnancy, right? Like, you know, sometimes when I'm in Ghana and I'm talking to specifically men, they'll talk about the conception moment as I gave birth to a child. And I'm always reminding them, like, no, that was one moment. There was like a whole process that happened before you saw a physical child, that 9-month process. And I feel like I want to bring that up because I really would liken the way that I work to the sort of like quiet, secret under, not secret in a bad way, but, quiet, not really sharing a lot, working in a smaller way, working in a quieter way, working in relationship to a context, a people, right? Working in relationship to reality, and building slowly to craft something.